Queenie Pacquiao orders Wagyu steak at her dad's restaurant. His reaction is shocking. It was just another warm Sunday afternoon in Manila, the kind where the sun spills over the city like melted gold, and the streets hum quietly as people settle in for late brunches and family gatherings. Tucked in the heart of the city's business district was a sleek, modern restaurant known for serving only the finest. Marble flooring, velvet chairs, crystal glasses, and a menu so elite that most people never dared to ask for prices. This was Pacquiao's Table, one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. What most people didn't know? It was owned by none other than boxing legend and national icon Manny Pacquiao. That day, a young woman stepped into the restaurant, alone, quiet, and unassuming. Her name? Queenie Pacquiao. Yes, that Pacquiao. But without an entourage, designer bag, or name-dropping, she looked just like any other 20-something woman trying to grab a nice lunch. Dressed in a plain white blouse and jeans, with her hair tied back in a casual ponytail, Queenie smiled politely at the host's stand. The manager glanced at her, barely lifting his eyes from the reservations list. "Do you have a booking this?" he asked, already sounding dismissive. "I was hoping to order a meal here. Just one, please." He sighed, not rudely but not warmly either. "We're very busy today. Walk-ins usually have to wait or come back." Behind her, a couple, clearly affluent, walked in. Laughter, luxury watches, the scent of expensive cologne. They were welcomed with immediate smiles and shown to a window seat. Queenie stood still, watching. She wasn't angry, just quiet. After a few moments, the manager waved her to a corner table near the kitchen, far from the prime spots. She nodded, sat down, and opened the menu. "I'll have the Wagyu steak, please," she said calmly when the waiter arrived. There was a pause. The waiter raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that, miss?" Queenie looked up. "Yes, medium rare." He scribbled it down slowly, almost reluctantly, then walked away without a word. Across the dining room, two waiters whispered. One chuckled. "She said she's getting the Wagyu. Think she even knows what that costs?" Queenie heard. She always did, but she didn't react. She sat still, sipping water quietly, her eyes scanning the room. The steak she ordered wasn't just food. It was a small test, a test of respect, and clearly she was failing it in their eyes. No one in the room knew who she was, or maybe they did and didn't believe her. But she wasn't here for attention. What she didn't know was that her father, the owner of this very restaurant, was about to walk in, and what he would witness would change everything. The clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversation filled the air, but Queenie sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded in her lap. Her steak hadn't arrived yet, though she'd placed her order over 20 minutes ago. From behind the glass entrance, a man stepped in. Dressed in a simple navy polo, jeans, and white sneakers, he looked like any other customer. Except he wasn't. Manny Pacquiao, 8-division world champion, senator, philanthropist, and yes, the owner of Pacquiao's Table, had just walked in through the front door of his own restaurant. He didn't announce himself, he didn't come with bodyguards. He just nodded politely at the host, like any regular person. But the staff noticed, instantly. The waiter who had scoffed at Queenie earlier straightened up. The manager who had rolled his eyes at her arrival suddenly stood taller, buttoning his blazer and rushing forward. "Sir Manny, good afternoon, sir," the manager beamed. Manny smiled back, warm but reserved. "Busy day?" "Yes, sir, fully booked. Let me get you your usual table." As he was being led through the restaurant, Manny's gaze swept the room. Familiar faces, regular customers. But then, in the far back corner, he spotted something that made him stop mid-step. There, sitting quietly by herself, was his daughter. Not at a family table, not being treated like the daughter of the man who owned the place, just sitting in the corner, waiting. A plate of bread sat untouched in front of her, a glass of water, and nothing else. Manny's eyes narrowed slightly. He turned to the manager. "Why is my daughter sitting by the kitchen door?" The manager froze. I didn't recognize her, sir. She didn't mention—" "I don't care if she's my daughter or not. Every guest in this restaurant should be treated with dignity, no matter how they dress, no matter if they come alone, no matter if they look rich or not." His voice echoed across the dining room. People paused their conversations. A few cell phones quietly started recording. "This restaurant carries my name, but it also carries my values. And if we can't treat every customer with basic respect, then we failed not just in business, but as human beings." Silence. The manager stepped forward again. "Sir Manny, we're truly sorry. This is not how we usually treat guests." Manny looked at him. "I'll be the judge of that." He turned back to Queenie. "Come on, Ak. Sit at my table. Let's eat together." And just like that, the tables turned, literally and metaphorically. But what Manny didn't know was that his quiet act of fatherhood was about to go viral, and what followed next would spark a national conversation. Queenie followed her father through the restaurant, her shoulders finally relaxing as they sat together at a reserved table near the center, the one usually reserved for VIPs. The contrast couldn't be more striking. Moments ago, she was just another overlooked guest in a quiet corner. Now, every eye in the restaurant followed her. Still, Manny wasn't concerned with appearances. He smiled warmly at her as a fresh plate of Wagyu steak was brought to the table, this time sizzling, perfectly plated, and prepared with obvious care. But Queenie hesitated. She looked at her father and whispered, "I don't want them to serve me just because they know who I am." Manny paused, put down his fork, and leaned in closer. "That's exactly the point, Anak. You shouldn't need a last name for people to treat you with respect." It wasn't just about the steak. It never had been. Meanwhile, across the restaurant, whispers turned into murmurs. Word spread like wildfire. Within minutes, 2 customers had already posted on social media. Manny Pacquiao just confronted his restaurant staff for disrespecting a guest. Turns out it was his daughter. Photos followed, then short videos, and then the inevitable hashtag, respect every guest. By the time Manny and Queenie finished their lunch, Twitter and Facebook were beginning to stir. Comments rolled in, praising Manny's calm but firm handling of the situation. This is how you use influence, not to punish, but to teach. Imagine if every business owner stood up for dignity like this. Her dad didn't shout, didn't throw money around, just reminded everyone what humanity looks like. Back inside the restaurant, the atmosphere had shifted. Staff were quieter, more attentive, but the damage was already done. As they prepared to leave, Manny walked up to the manager and handed him a note. "This isn't a punishment, it's a reminder. I want every member of this team, front and back of house, to attend a workshop I'm sponsoring for customer care, empathy, and equality. Not next month, this weekend." The manager nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, of course. And no tips are to be accepted today. Every guest eats free, because today we fix what was broken." Queenie looked up at her father, surprised. "But Papa, that'll cost a lot." Manny smiled. "Some lessons are worth the price." That afternoon, Queenie and Manny left quietly. No cameras followed them outside, but inside the restaurant, the weight of the moment lingered. The staff began to whisper to one another, some embarrassed, others deeply reflective. The waiter who had laughed at Queenie earlier stood silently in the back, looking down. He knew. They all did.
This wasn't just about a rich customer. This was about a missed opportunity to do the right thing. And while the outside world was only just beginning to react, Pacquiao's table was already transforming. That evening, the first local blog picked up the story. By the next morning, it was trending nationally. Headlines read, "Manny Pacquiao teaches grace in power after staff snubs his daughter." From steak to statement, how one lunch sparked a hospitality shakeup. Fighter, father, leader, Pacquiao proves again why he's the people's champ. And behind every share, like, and comment, one message rose to the top. Respect should never depend on status. Every person deserves dignity. But the story wasn't over yet. What began in one restaurant was about to spread far wider, igniting uncomfortable conversations in boardrooms, kitchens, and schools across the country. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Queenie Pacquiao's name was trending alongside her father's, not because of who she was related to, but because of what she represented. Respect, fairness, the right to be seen even without fame. The incident at the restaurant had struck a chord far deeper than anyone expected. Social media feeds across the Philippines and soon beyond were filled with debates, testimonials, and shared personal stories from people who had felt unseen in places where they were supposed to feel welcome. A university student tweeted, "I once walked into a boutique in my school uniform and was followed around like I was going to steal something. Thank you, Queenie, for showing that even the rich get mistreated and that it's not okay for anyone." A domestic worker in Hong Kong wrote, "I cried watching the video. I've been turned away from restaurants just because of how I look. You are our voice, Queenie." It was no longer about one steak. It was now a symbol, a reminder that dignity isn't a luxury. Queenie, still shaken from the experience, had no idea the impact she had made. When her father showed her the viral posts, her first response was disbelief. "But I didn't do anything, Papa." Manny smiled, putting his hand on her shoulder. "You didn't back down. You didn't shout or fight. You simply existed and expected to be treated with decency. That was enough to reveal a much bigger problem." Back at Pacquiao's table, things were moving fast. Manny didn't stop at training the staff. He called a meeting with the entire restaurant group, from frontline servers to executive chefs. His message was direct. We don't just feed people, we serve them with honor. If a guest walks in with nothing but respect in their pocket, that should be enough to earn ours in return. Within days, every restaurant in his chain implemented a new internal policy: zero tolerance for class-based discrimination, anonymous guest evaluations to identify bias in service, and a mandatory empathy in hospitality workshop co-led by Queenie herself. Yes, Queenie. Though nervous at first, she agreed to speak, not as the daughter of a celebrity, but as a young woman who had felt the sting of being unseen. At the first workshop, she stood in front of 40 staff members, her voice calm but firm. "You probably didn't know who I was. That's okay. But how would you have treated me if I were your own daughter, your niece? What if I were you, just one paycheck away from eating out only once a year?" The room was silent. One of the kitchen assistants, a woman named Mira, wiped a tear from her eye. Queenie continued, "This isn't about guilt, it's about growth, about making sure no one ever leaves this place feeling small." The workshops became a hit. Word of them spread beyond the restaurant group. Other hospitality brands reached out, asking for Queenie to speak. Schools wanted her to visit. She even received an invitation to speak at a regional conference on youth and social leadership. And through it all, she remained grounded. At home, she still teased her dad when he burned toast. She still wore oversized hoodies and listened to old-school R&B. But something inside her had changed. She wasn't just Queenie Pacquiao anymore. She was becoming a voice. And while some critics claimed this was just a PR stunt, those closest to the movement knew better. They'd seen the look in the waiter's eyes when he realized who Queenie was. They'd seen the power of humility wrapped in grace. More importantly, they saw what could happen when influence was used not to intimidate, but to educate. With the workshops gaining momentum and Queenie's message spreading. The energy around Pacquiao's table was shifting. The restaurant that had once turned her away was now a symbol of reformation. But with attention, especially the kind that touches nerves, comes criticism. And Queenie was about to face it head-on. It started with a blog post titled, "Celebrity Privilege Disguised as Social Justice." The author, a popular opinion columnist, accused Queenie of playing victim for clout and claimed that the entire incident was a carefully staged publicity stunt to boost the Pacquiao restaurant brand. She wasn't mistreated because of classism. She was ignored because she didn't announce who she was. That's not injustice, it's anonymity. The post went viral, fast. People who had never heard Queenie's name before suddenly had an opinion about her. Some questioned her sincerity. Others accused her father of using the restaurant as a stage to push a personal agenda. A few even mocked her emotional workshop moments, reducing them to rich girl tears. Queenie saw the comments. She tried not to read too much, but even the strongest filters can't block out everything. At first, it hurt. She had opened herself up, shared her experience, and tried to do something positive. Was it all a mistake? Manny noticed her silence over dinner that night. "Want to talk about it?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe they're right, Papa. Maybe I should have just walked away and not made it a thing. I didn't ask to become some kind of symbol." He leaned back, thinking for a moment. Symbols aren't chosen. They're made when people see themselves in you. And yes, some people won't understand. That's okay. But don't let the loudest voices drown out the truth. He paused, looking directly at her. The real question is, do you still believe what you're doing matters? She didn't answer right away, but her silence wasn't doubt. It was reflection. That night, Queenie sat at her desk rereading some of the letters that had been sent to her over the past few weeks. One was from a teenage girl in Mindanao who had been denied entry to a private club because of her clothes. Another was from an elderly man in Cebu, sharing how he'd worked as a janitor for 40 years and had been ignored his whole life. These people weren't actors in a publicity stunt. They were proof that what happened to her was part of something bigger. So the next day, she made a decision. She posted a video, raw, unpolished, and straight from her heart. "Hi, I know some of you think I made a big deal out of nothing. Maybe it would have been easier to just let it go. But what happened to me happens to people every day. People who can't speak up, who don't have famous parents or cameras watching. This isn't about revenge. It's about awareness. If you've ever felt small in a place you should have been treated with kindness, this is for you." She ended with one sentence that quieted even the harshest critics. Real change doesn't start when you're comfortable. It starts when you're questioned. The video spread like wildfire. But this time, the reaction was different. Commenters flooded in with apologies, support, and admiration. Even the original columnist who wrote the hit piece released a follow-up saying, "Whether I agree with her methods or not, I can't deny her message hit home." The backlash didn't stop, but it shifted. Queenie wasn't just surviving it, she was growing from it. The movement had faced its first real test, and it passed, not because of the perfect strategy, but because of an imperfect young woman who stayed honest when it counted. Weeks after her heartfelt video reignited public support, Queenie found herself facing a new challenge and opportunity. An invitation had arrived from the National Youth and Education Summit, the country's largest annual gathering of educators, policymakers, student leaders, and social advocates. The organizers had watched Queenie's video, reviewed her initiative, and were deeply moved. They asked her to deliver the keynote address on inclusion and the power of student voice. When she first read the email, Queenie froze. She wasn't a professional speaker. She wasn't an activist by training. She was just a 17-year-old girl who once got dismissed at a fancy restaurant and chose to speak up instead of staying silent. Was that really enough? Her father, standing behind her, saw the hesitation in her eyes. "You've already given the speech," Manny said quietly. "Every time you stood up for someone who couldn't." He was right. Still, standing in front of a national audience, with cameras, journalists, and high-profile guests, was intimidating. But Queenie accepted. Not because she was ready, but because change never waits for you to feel ready. On the day of the summit, the convention hall was packed. Over 3,000 people filled the seats, with thousands more watching online. As Queenie stepped onto the stage, the screen behind her displayed her name and a single line beneath it: Daughter, Student, Advocate. She paused for a moment, adjusted the mic, and began. "When I was 10, I used to think that having a famous last name meant people would always treat me well. I learned that wasn't true the day I walked into a restaurant my dad owns and got dismissed without a second glance." Laughter bubbled gently in the room, the kind that welcomed, not mocked. "At first, I was embarrassed. Then, I was angry. And then, I realized something. If that could happen to me, with all my so-called privilege, what must it feel like for someone without it?" Her tone shifted. "We talk about equality in schools and inclusion in policy, but what about in practice? What about the way a student is treated when they speak with an accent, or wear hand-me-down uniforms, or bring rice and tuyo for lunch instead of ham sandwiches?" You could hear a pin drop. It's easy to say we want to create safe spaces. Harder to recognize when we've made someone feel unsafe. Not with violence, but with silence, with neglect, with the quiet message, "You don't belong here." Her voice didn't waver. "I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I finally stopped being silent. The day I felt invisible at my dad's restaurant was painful, but it woke me up. It made me ask, what if we didn't wait for someone to be famous to treat them with respect?" The applause began softly, then built. "My dad once told me, real strength isn't about how hard you hit. It's about how you carry those who are hurting. That's what this is about. Lifting others, not just speaking for them, but with them." She took a breath. "To every student who's been ignored, to every teacher who wants to do better, to every leader wondering if change is worth the effort, I promise you it is. Because when one voice rises, others find the courage to join." The audience rose to their feet, a standing ovation. Manny, seated in the front row, wiped a tear from his cheek. This wasn't the timid teenager who once called him crying. This was a young woman owning her voice and using it to move a nation. After the speech, news outlets lit up with praise. "Queenie Pacquiao steals the show with powerful plea for dignity in schools." From silence to spotlight, how one student sparked a national conversation. Not just Manny's daughter, a voice of a generation. But more than the headlines, what mattered most were the stories that came in afterward. Principals shared how they'd begun reviewing policies. Students sent letters saying they felt inspired to speak up. Teachers asked for Queenie's program materials to implement in their own classrooms. And so, the Pacquiao Cultural Respect Initiative was no longer just a school program. It was evolving into a national student empowerment movement. Queenie didn't set out to lead anything,
But in a world aching for change, the people who lead are often the ones who simply refuse to accept the way things are. The months that followed Queenie's speech at the National Youth and Education Summit were nothing short of transformational. The Pacquiao Cultural Respect Initiative, originally created as a local response to a single incident, had now spread to over 100 schools across the Philippines. It was no longer just a curriculum or a reporting system. It had become a movement, one led not by bureaucrats or celebrities, but by students who saw their worth and found the courage to claim it. The impact was everywhere. In Manila, a public school in Tondo launched its Lone Voice Week, where students shared their experiences with discrimination and helped design their school's inclusion plan. In Cebu, a university adopted Queenie's framework and integrated it into their freshman orientation and teacher training programs. Even small private institutions in provinces like Baguio, Davao, and Iloilo began adapting the initiative to fit their own cultural contexts. What made this different from most top-down education reforms was that it didn't start with adults telling kids what to think. It began with a kid demanding to be heard. And people listened. One morning, as Queenie was working on her college applications and helping organize another student workshop, her phone rang. It was an unknown international number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello? Is this Queenie Pacquiao?" "Yes, speaking." "This is Alice Mandara from UNESCO's Global Youth Alliance. We've been following your work on cultural equity in education, and we'd like to invite you to speak at the upcoming World Youth Education Congress in Geneva." Queenie's breath caught. Geneva? UNESCO? The world stage? Are you sure?" she asked, still stunned. "More than sure. We don't just want you to speak. We want to feature your initiative as a case study for inclusive policy design. You're not just a student voice, you're a blueprint for youth-led change." The invitation included all expenses paid, flights, accommodation, and even a private tour of the UN headquarters. But more than that, it meant her message was reaching beyond borders. When she told her parents, Manny paused, then slowly smiled. "I always thought I would be the one flying to Switzerland to speak," he joked, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But I think the world's more interested in your fight now." As they hugged, Queenie realized something profound. Her father's legacy would always be tied to boxing, titles, and championships. But hers? It would be tied to voices and change. The auditorium in Geneva was grand. High ceilings, polished marble floors, flags from every nation. But as Queenie stepped onto the global platform, she didn't feel small. She felt ready. Her speech began not with her own story, but with someone else's. "There's a girl in Davao named Mia. She doesn't speak perfect English. She brings adobo and rice to school every day. For months, she sat silently in the back of the classroom, ignored, laughed at, and almost invisible. Until one day, a teacher played a video of a girl named Queenie, who had once been made to feel invisible too. That day, Mia stood up, for the first time ever, and shared her story. Queenie's voice was steady, confident, no longer the daughter of a world champion, but a change-maker in her own right. The fight for dignity isn't just in courts or Congress. It's in cafeterias, in classrooms, in whispers that exclude, and jokes that cut. But it's also in the courage to say, "I see you. You matter." She closed with these words, "Change begins not when others speak for us, but when we speak for ourselves and are met not with silence, but with action." The entire hall erupted. After the session, global education leaders from Kenya, Brazil, Canada, and Indonesia approached her with one message: "We want to bring your program to our schools." Back home in the Philippines, the news made waves. Manny Pacquiao's daughter addresses the UN, and she's not talking about boxing. Queenie Pacquiao's inclusion model goes global. Even international outlets like BBC, Al Jazeera, and CNN began reporting on the initiative, praising how a single student had sparked international policy conversations. A year later, the Pacquiao Cultural Respect Initiative was rebranded as the Global Student Dignity Project, co-managed by Queenie and a coalition of young leaders from 12 countries. Her work earned her the International Human Rights Youth Award, a Time magazine Next Generation Leader feature, and an honorary seat on the UNESCO Youth Education Advisory Board. But Queenie remained grounded. She still volunteered at community schools, still answered student emails herself, still walked into her father's restaurant from time to time, but now not as a girl trying to be taken seriously, but as a young woman who had earned the world's attention through integrity, resilience, and vision. Years later, when asked during an international interview what her proudest moment was, Queenie didn't mention the UN stage, or the awards, or the headlines. She said, "It was the day a young girl messaged me from a rural village saying, 'I told my teacher what happened, and she listened.' That was the day I knew the world was actually changing." And when Manny Pacquiao was asked what his proudest fight was, he didn't mention the titles or the rivalries. He smiled, pointed to his daughter's photograph on his office wall, and simply said, "The one I didn't fight with my fists, but with my values." Sometimes the most powerful punches are not thrown in a ring, but delivered on a stage, with a mic, a message, and the courage to speak. And just like that, a humiliated girl at a fancy restaurant changed the world, not by shouting, but by standing.